Welcome back, everyone. This is your favorite comic podcast, Comic DNA. I am Aaron Walther, and with me is my good friend Luke Thompson Moritz.
Oh, thank you.
This is episode 6, and on today's episode, we are going to be talking about My Friend Dahmer, written and illustrated by Derf Backderf. This is, I think if you listened to our previous podcast, the Weapon X episode, you will have heard me say this is our first non-fiction comic that we're doing. What My Friend Dahmer is a memoir comic by Derf about his time in high school. And he had a unique experience in high school because he went to high school with Jeffrey Dahmer, who is an infamous serial killer who I think he killed like 17 people between 1978 and 1999 until he was eventually caught in the early 90s. And ever since that story broke, Derf has he's been kind of doing this My Friend Dahmer comic. He started with like some short stories early in the 90s, and then he put out like a single issue version of the story in 2002.
You said early in the 90s?
Yeah, like
okay.
Right after, I think like right around the time Dahmer was killed, in 94. I think 94 is when...
That's surreal. I didn't know that.
Yeah, Derf started doing comics, like toying with this idea of My Friend Dahmer, like around that time. So mid-90s, I guess you could say. And he put out the single issue in 2002 of My Friend Dahmer, which was like a 22-page, some 30-page version of the story, just kind of like a few specific memories he has of Dahmer. And then in 2012, he was finally able to put out the big 220-page comprehensive graphic novel, My Friend Dahmer, which is a really, really good book.
Yes.
Yes.
If it's on here, it's probably pretty good.
I mean, it's definitely something that connects with me because that's why we're doing it. But
yes.
I'm a big fan of Derf. He's like a cool alt comics kind of a guy. He had a comic strip called The City that appeared in a lot of alternative newspapers. Now, I wasn't really much of a reader of The City, but he did start doing graphic novels in the 2000s. And the first time I really got hooked on Derf was when he put out his graphic novel Punk Rock and Trailer Parks, which is a real cool punk rock kind of a story that takes place in the 80s about teenagers kind of getting into the punk rock scene in Akron, Ohio at the time. That's when you had a lot of the cool punk bands like Devo and the Cramps were all kind of a part of that scene. And so I've got a little bit of the punk rock in me. I'm not like a real big punk rocker. I'm too young to be a real punk rocker.
Right.
But Derf is not. Derf has some legitimate punk rock in him, and he was there kind of around that time, as I understand it. So it's a cool book. That's a totally fiction book. But he's also done another memoir comic called Trashed, which is about his time working as a garbage man in Ohio, in his rural hometown. And I really liked Trash too. It's really funny. But yeah, My Friend Dahmer is definitely a big book for him. It's gotten a lot of media attention. I know it was pretty successful when it came out, as I understand it. And it's also like a really heavy book, obviously, because the subject matter is very morbid and very serious. I mean, Jeffrey Dahmer is, an infamous serial killer. Yeah. So definitely a very unique book. But yeah, needless to say, I really like the book. I have been excited to read it ever since I'd heard that it was finally coming out. And that is exactly why we are talking about it in the podcast.
That's right.
So, Luke, when I told you that we were going to do My Friend Dahmer for this comic, you'd never heard of Derf, you'd never read anything by him, you didn't know what the book was.
Not a thing.
Not a thing. So,
except what I knew about Jeffrey Dahmer specifically.
Yes, yeah, that is what I was going to ask you. Were you like aware of who Jeffrey Dahmer was?
To a degree.
Yeah, I mean he's kind of a pop culture character at this point.
Yeah, he's,
you know.
you can't, he's like, unfortunately, a household name. Like, you bring Jeffrey Dahmer up, first thing everyone says is like, oh, wasn't that serial killer? Like, that's, you know, he's got that stigma with him, understandably. I was really excited when you were talking about it, because I always have this really weird fascination with serial killers. You know, like, it's not like...
Anytime I hear somebody say that, like a little like warning sign goes off in my head.
Like back off.
Obsessed with serial killers, eh?
I wouldn't say obsessed. It's just...
Okay, I'm sorry.
From a mental standpoint, in my head, it blows my mind that, like, these people wake up one day and go, you know what, I'm going to kill people today. It's just what I'm going to do. Or, you know, rather, they get the urge in their head that they need to do this. That's fascinating.
Well, I think that's completely natural, and I think most people are that way, because, you know, most people, we all have an understanding of, like, the average person's life and, like, you know, shared experiences, and a serial killer is somebody who it's not a shared experience. Most people are not murderers, let alone serial murderers. So it is something that is always going to be a curiosity for everybody. Everybody's, you know, how does somebody do that? How do they want to do that? What made them do that? These are the kind of questions that I think everybody's going to always be asking and always be curious about for all of eternity.
Most of the
everybody,
time, right. Most of the time, like, a deviation from the norm, no matter how severe or minuscule it is, always catches someone's attention. You know, if you see someone with I can't think of an example specifically. You know, like, differences always catch your eye, no matter what they are, whether they be physical, mental. You know, there's multiple times where in high school, you know, there was a kid in one of my classes that had a tic, and he would hit his hand against the desk all the time. He just had this really nervous tic. And just that little bit of noise always had me, like, going around going, like, why is he doing that? And it's, you know, it's you know, a similar scale, just on a much grander scale to this. You know, it's, why did he do this? Why? That was part of why I was really interested to read this, was I didn't know how much of Jeffrey Dahmer this tied into. So I was interested to see, you know, did this go into when he started killing people, or was this just, you know, young Jeffrey Dahmer? And, you know, obviously once I read it, my questions were answered. But it was still fascinating to every degree.
So yeah, I guess we should explain basically what the book is. It is, as I said, it's about Derf's time in high school, but it's specifically about his time and how his life related to Jeffrey Dahmer, because Derf and a few of his friends were all kind of involved with Jeffrey Dahmer during high school. I think it's safe to say, just, you know, from the way Derf describes it in the book, they were basically like the closest thing Dahmer had to friends.
He was fan club, as they...
Yeah, the Jeffrey Dahmer fan club. So I think that's what's really interesting about the title, and I think a lot of people find it misleading, but by calling it My Friend Dahmer, and then, you know, he's setting up like an expectation, like somebody with an inside look into the life of Jeffrey Dahmer.
It's like one of the people that visited him in jail and got in-depth interviews from him or something.
But that's not exactly what it is.
No.
What it more or less is an observation from somebody who was there at the time, but was about as close as anybody outside of Dahmer's immediate family could be to him, and still really wasn't that close, which I think is very telling about Jeffrey Dahmer's isolation and the overall loneliness and being the outsider that he was. Is that, you know, the guy that calls him sort of Dahmer's friend, even in the book he makes a point of saying he wasn't really friends with Dahmer and he didn't want to be friends with Dahmer.
There was multiple points in the story. Yeah, there was multiple points in the story where he even tried to separate, sort of. You know, he tried to not get close.
Yeah. So, it's a really interesting book. One of the things that I kind of, it makes me think of, I guess, what's really interesting about the book is how it's sort of like a almost like a lightning in a bottle kind of a thing. Like Derf is a cartoonist. He's a creative guy. He writes these memoir comics, and he is tied to this huge event. The life of Jeffrey Dahmer.
Right.
That's big. So it's almost like it's just so serendipitous that somebody like him would go on to be a prolific creator and then have this experience with Dahmer so that he could actually talk about it and do something about it. This is kind of a side note, but it really just made me think of there's a comic. I know, Luke, you haven't read it. Maybe we'll do it for a podcast. But there was a comic called Why the Last Man, written by Brian K. Vaughan. And the synopsis of the story is it's a science fiction story where all the men on the planet die except for one guy. And so the main character is this guy called York, and it's all about his adventures on this planet, trying to survive and all the different things going on. But there's a specific
that sounds right up my alley.
It's actually really good, so I guess we will have to do it. But there's a really good part where York is really depressed, and he's got these this group of people that he's traveling with, these group of women that he's traveling with, and they're trying to figure out what the mystery of what caused all the men to die. But there's a part where he's really depressed, and he's really in this self-loathing pity where he's complaining about why was he the one to survive, and it should have been somebody who could do something about it. It should have been somebody like Chuck Palahniuk who could write about it and be thoughtful and philosophical about it. But York's just a regular guy who is stupid and fed up with it. And that's kind of what I think of when I think of My Friend Dahmer. How perfect is it that Derf would be the guy who could go on? He was the right guy in the right place to
document these,
it, and just really give us something completely unique.
Right, because
really
even hit Derf's other friends, they all went on to do other, one of them I think that ended up becoming a lawyer, and it's Derf really was the perfect guy to, be friends with Dahmer.
Friends with...
I did quotes over here.
Yeah, I can't see when you do the air quotes.
Quote, unquote, Dahmer. Oh, no, wait, quote, unquote, friends. There we go.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, he really was the perfect person to do it because, I noticed as as I started reading, how descriptive all the things were. How descriptive this book was. And it's most of the time with comics, the imagery does a lot of the work for you when it's, describing the scenery and the so on and so forth. Derf is explaining every little detail it's photographic memory, and that impressed me beyond all belief.
Yeah, I think he does a good job with where the narration is needed and where it's not needed.
Right. It was very early. I noticed it early on that he was being very descriptive, just to kind of warm us up to everything that's going on. As
from the way I read it, it looks like Derf has a lot to say about with his specific interactions with Dahmer.
Right.
But then part of fleshing this whole thing out into a narrative, into a full story, is he is also taking other people's stories and his friends, stories that his friends tell him, or even just information from that were already publicized, after Dahmer was caught.
In the big trade paperback, there's even
it's all there's the bibliography, and the source is all there. So I don't think he's taking liberties or anything, but he does do a good job of kind of going back and creating a comprehensive history to fill in where he wasn't there,
right?
And, what he specifically didn't have to do with. But ultimately, it is just about his experiences and his
whether they were with Dahmer directly or what happened from being interacting with Dahmer.
With his friends,
like you were saying, with his friends. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What I really like about the book is how Derf kind of just gives you a story about high school life as he remembers it.
Yeah.
But then there's just this little twist where the story of high school life has the 2020 hindsight understanding that one of this outsider kid that he's talking about grew up to be a notorious serial killer.
And it's that's always joked about, within high school cliques. And it's I don't want to mess with that kid for whenever he comes back to the school with a gun. It's it's surreal seeing that, like you were saying, this does seem like a high school life, you know.
Oh, it is. I mean, it's just about
is.
a story of Derf and his friends, and they're just goofing around.
But there also happens to be one of the most famous serial killers ever around them. And I noticed that too with the cover, how like they were really washed out grays and browns on the cover and stuff. That was kind of like, I don't know, it's a
real good looking cover.
It is. It really is. Especially
I specifically like how he's got Dahmer drawn with the blank expression that he always has.
For the whole book too, which is nice. Yeah.
He always has the same expression, which is how he was.
Right.
But with Dahmer in the center, staring directly at the viewer, and then there's 4 kids in the corner of the book surrounding him, and all the other kids have their eyes closed, except for one kid, which is supposed to be Derf, who is sort of like apathetically, cautiously looking at Dahmer. Now that tells you really everything you need to know about this book, because what it tells you is that nobody pays attention to Dahmer. Everybody has their eyes closed. They're not paying attention to him, except for one person, and he is still even only, like, barely paying attention.
And see, if I would have known that was Derf prior to reading this book, like, if I would have known that was him on the cover, staring at Dahmer, I would have clicked with that assumption also. But I didn't know anything about Derf going into this, and so on and so forth. But no, that really does speak volumes just from the cover alone.
Yeah, it's a good cover.
And yeah, it's obviously worth noting. I love Derf's style, drawing wise. He's got such that like typical cartoon, or not typical. He's got such a very comfortable, easy on the eyes cartoon style.
Yeah, I mean it's a really it's an alt comics cartooning style. It's somewhere between comic strip and full page comics. There's like what I like about Derf's style is there's almost a stiffness to the way how all of his characters are posed, but they still don't look that rigid. Like he draws them like he outlines muscles and things like that. So it's there's a lot of shading.
I noticed the shading was really strong, and that caught my eye more than once. And I also think it's worth noting I'm really glad it's in black and white for some like. I think it's much stronger in black and white. I don't know. I feel like a lot of the creepiness wouldn't be like as portrayed as strongly if it was in color. Like the shadows would be there and everything, but being the black and white, the shadows are so heavy and apparent. Like that's the only other thing. So,
yeah, it's a good style that works really well in black and white. It allows the cartooning style to just kind of be itself.
Yeah, it's very free flowing. So yeah.
I'm a big fan of Derf's cartooning.
Let's get into the meat of this book.
Yeah, that's what I was kind of.
Because we've already kind of talked about the idea of what the book is. It's
what it is.
Derf's experiences with Jeffrey Dahmer. So let's talk about what we liked.
What were you expecting from the book? Like you knew it was going to be about Dahmer.
Honest to God, because I knew so little about everything pertaining to this book, I expected it to be like the build up to his first kill, and because that's the first thing I think of when I think of Dahmer is the serial killer aspect, obviously.
Yeah.
So yeah, I more or less just expected it to be the build up to his first kill, the
which
repercussions.
is almost kind of what it was.
Yeah, a very long and in-depth build up to it, but just from a different viewpoint. I expected it to be like Derf was there a little bit, but it was going to be a lot of Jeffrey Dahmer. It was a lot of Jeffrey Dahmer, but
yeah, that's an important thing to note.
Yeah.
I mean, the book is as much about Derf himself as it is about Dahmer.
There's multiple panels or multiple pages that are like it'll show a page in the life of Derf, and then it'll show the same scenario.
Well, yeah, it's about their mirrored life experiences. Right. They both went to the same high school. They both had very similar families, whereas Derf had, what could be said, a good family.
Yeah, a very structured home
style. And Dahmer had a bad family.
Yeah.
Like, to put it in the simplest terms possible. And it's just sort of how, they both have this similar shared experience, and they're both completely different people.
Yeah. Which I love the whole two sides to the coin thing, you know. Yeah, that's essentially what I expected. I really didn't know what else to expect. I went into it with a pretty, you know, open slate, just so I could kind of be surprised by it. Because I love, you know, a lot of the time it's just, you know, you'll already know the whole book by the time you read it, sort of thing.
Yeah.
So with this, you know, I'm really glad that it wasn't just like a complete recollection of Dahmer's life. You know, it was very fresh, and I'm glad that it exceeded my expectations. Let's put it that way. Very good.
Yeah. I really liked the tone of the book. It had this real, like, almost procedural style where he's just kind of like, he's got a memory and he kind of tells you about it, and then he illustrates this, like, a scene as it plays out.
Right.
And it just kind of, like, moves back and forth between, you know, this is what we know happened, this is what I saw happen, this is what happened with me, this is what happened with Dahmer, this is what happened with my friends. And it's got this real, like, creeping pace.
Yeah.
Which, you know, really helps, like, with the tone and the atmosphere of the book, because it's not just somber, but it's really almost tragic.
It is. There was multiple scenes of, like, you know, the first time you get to experience Dahmer's parents fighting. He lays down and just, like, cries himself to sleep. That was the first time where I was like, am I really sympathizing with Jeffrey Dahmer? Like, hold up.
Yeah, that's...
Because, you know, there was one...
piece of work.
Yeah, there was the one day that Derf came into class, or, you know, he was explaining the story and saying, then one day Dahmer just snapped. And it was like, you know, before that, he was a weird kid, but it's like, he could have been just a normal weird kid. There was just things piling on top of one another that just eventually, I don't want to say made him, you know, crack, but it didn't help.
Yeah. You know, yeah, like Derf talks about in the preface about how important it is to, what does he say? He doesn't want to paint Dahmer as too sympathetic of a figure. I was trying to find exactly what he said. How it's important not to feel too sorry for him, but at the same time, like, you could empathize, or maybe that's what it was. Not to have too much empathy for him, but you can still sympathize.
Right.
Like how unfortunate.
You know, it could have been so much different. You know, there was multiple times where Derf in the book was like, why didn't I try to stop him? Why didn't I try to... You know, there's one at the end of a chapter specifically, he's saying, you know, why didn't I stop him? Why didn't I step in? Why didn't I be his friend?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. The book does raise that question of... He kind of moralizes the situation of, you know, on the one hand, he's like, you know, why didn't anybody do anything? What, you know, we were encouraging Dahmer to be a weirdo,
right?
But and then he kind of, like, goes back and forth, but he says, but then again, we were just a bunch of dumb kids, so
right.
You know, what were we supposed to know? And then he asks the question, where were the damn adults?
Right.
What did you think about that? Like,
that really spoke volumes to me personally, because there was so many times in, you know, growing up and in school and stuff, like, that thought always kind of resonated in the back of my head. Like, I'd see these kids getting picked on and whatever, and it's like, why isn't anyone stepping in? Like, why aren't any adults stepping into this? Like, it was kind of, you know, I'm sure all of us got bullied in school at one point or another, and it's like, where are the adults? You know, with that one specifically, it's like, this kid has obviously got something going on. Like, there's with Dahmer specifically, there's something going on with him. Like, whether it be, you know, when he does those whole when he does the imitation of the interior decorator, but it's actually his mom, you know, you come to find out, it's like, that should be a red card for a teacher. And later into the book, I believe this happened after the "Where are the damn adults" line, but it's like, when he comes in smelling like alcohol and stuff, like, why didn't someone step in on that?
Yeah, that's always a tough thing.
Yeah,
I think Derf also he also does try to like make you understand that like high school in the 70s was different.
way different. Yeah,
Was different.
all
Yeah.
the teachers that were like, he did a panel that was like the teacher saying he could roll a bigger joint than the kid.
Yeah, I mean,
And it's like
teachers in the 70s were the counterculture hippies of the 60s. Who
part
had
of it, yeah,
to go out
part
and
of it
get
too
jobs.
was, yeah, right. Part of it too was like, he notes all the time that Dahmer just kind of drifted in and out. He wasn't necessarily a wallflower, but no one really paid, no one noticed him. He just,
Well, I think the important thing about that is, Dahmer wasn't necessarily acting out
yeah,
in high school. Like, he got picked on, and he pulled pranks, and he would occasionally, like, the book kind of paints, or just, the book kind of describes him as how he kind of became this, like, cult icon for the high school.
right.
But he wasn't
Makeshift
necessarily, like, he wasn't acting out. Like, he wasn't, like, getting into fights or starting fires, or whatever he was doing, he wasn't necessarily getting caught. The drinking was obvious, but I think you can kind of place some of that in the time period
Right.
of
It was a different time.
it was a different time where people weren't as they weren't cracking down on drinking beer, even kids drinking beer as much as they do now. I mean, heck, it wasn't even until the 70s that they passed the 21-year-old law. Like, it was 18 years old for a long time.
Wow.
Up until the 70s, it became 21. So honestly, a 17-year-old kid drinking beer, most people at the time probably didn't care.
They just batted an eye
Now,
at it.
now, like Derf explains, like, it was obvious that, like, there's the scene where they have Dahmer, they're gonna go pull the big prank in the mall,
Oh, yeah.
and Dahmer has to get his stuff, and
He
gets
chugs the six-pack in the car,
chugs a
yeah.
six-pack of beer, and Derf says, like, even as a teenager, like, I understood that this was different. This wasn't party drinking. This was different. This was serious.
Right.
So yes, what Dahmer was doing was a red flag, but at the same time, the fact that it was just alcohol, I know, just alcohol.
Right.
I think, at the time period, a lot of people wouldn't have really paid attention to it, or they would have thought that it was none of their business.
Yeah. And that's really unfortunate because, like, let's say he would have had a chance to talk to the school counselor or anything. It's cliche, but it's, that could have saved his tons of victims, tons of his victims' lives.
Could have saved lives.
Yeah. And, who knows if that one person could have just got through to him, what would have happened? What if it would have been Derf? What if it would have been the counselor? What if it would have been a teacher? It's a bunch of what ifs, and it's hard to pinpoint which one, like, could have really made an impact, if any of them would have made an impact. But
a situation like this, like, I wonder how much of an influence, like, an outside source could have had.
Right, because
not to say that I think Dahmer was, like, destined, guaranteed to be a serial killer.
Right.
But I do kind of wonder, like, how much influence could somebody have had?
Right,
On
like,
like him?
people take for granted that, just talking to someone about stuff like that, regardless of who it is, why you're doing it, whatever, that makes a difference, regardless how little it is. Even if it's just a little bit, like, they cheer you up for a day, sort of thing. Like, they even note Derf even notes in the book, like, that one day, that one variable could have saved a life. With the jogger not running in front of his house that one day, that saved the guy's life.
That's weird to think about, that kind of, like, that, like, butterfly effect.
Yeah.
Like, who knows what was going on in the jogger's life that he decided not to run that day, but that had happened to be the day that Dahmer decided he was going to attack him.
Yeah.
And that happened to be the day that the jogger decided not to run.
Right.
It's and that's kind of what I'm talking about. Like, there's so many complexities that go into a person's psyche and like, creating,
especially someone to the degree of Dahmer.
And there's so many different sources coming from all directions that create your psyche, and that then create the situations that you act on. So that's why I say I wonder, not to say that I have too much, or that I have doubt about that anybody could have prevented Dahmer from becoming a serial killer, because I'm certain that it could have happened. but it's like it's too complex of a situation to just go like to just read the book and say, oh, if people were nice to Dahmer in high school, he wouldn't have become a serial killer.
Right. There's
way more
far too much going on.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's like, you know, halfway through the book, you know, Derf notes that, like, there was a spot that Dahmer was just too far gone to be saved, you know? And from there on out, that would have been like a, you know, yeah, someone could have talked to him, but I think his mind was already set, you know? And it's really, I don't want to use the word frightening, I guess. It's just, I don't know. The way Derf writes Dahmer, as you know, early on in the book, about how he was just this weird kid who had these weird tendencies and whatnot, with the whole, melting the roadkill.
Yeah, his fascination with roadkill.
Yeah. And it's like, that's really weird. Don't get me wrong, but it's like, you know, who knows why that escalated? You know,
well, and
Derf
the thing
doesn't.
too, it's like, you know, there are lots of weird kids, but they don't all become serial killers.
Right. You know, we all had our weird stuff.
Speak for yourself.
Whoa!
What kind of weird stuff did
listen
you
here, suspenders and cowboy hat.
I'm just kidding.
You're not kidding. I know you're not. But no, like everyone's got their quirks, and it's like that was really weird, yeah. But it wasn't, you know, it wasn't where it was at the end of the book, you know, or like hinting to where it was at the end of the book. Yeah, it probably would have continued to escalate to where, you know, the scene where he killed the dog, you know, and hung its parts up in the woods. It probably would have got to that. You know, I can't say one way or the other. I've never experienced something that intense of a quirk, I guess.
Right.
But, you know, it could have made something could have made a difference early on. You know, what if his parents wouldn't have got divorced? That seemed like it had a big effect on him. Was his mom dwindling down after this?
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. I definitely think that was probably one of the biggest influences in Dahmer's life. And that's kind of something that comes from a serial killer profile. Like, nearly all serial killers come from broken homes.
Right.
Like, they all have family issues and specifically mother issues. You know, which is not to say that, you know, all divorced kids go on to become serial killers. That is obviously not the case. But it is interesting to, you know, you wonder, like, how much of an influence that had. You know,
right.
If it's
the way Derf wrote it, you know, he made it sound like that was a big hit. You know, the way the imagery he used, and especially near the end when his mother just leaves.
Yeah.
I feel like that was the final nail in the coffin. Like, that was where Jeffrey Dahmer just went, you know what? What do I have left to do? Like, what do I have left?
There's a lot of, like, poetic irony in the story, the way Derf tells it. You know, I think it's, ultimately, My Friend Dahmer is a book about loneliness.
Oh,
it's a book. It's a book about, you know, like, going through adolescence and the loneliness that I think most people feel when they're trying to, like, find themselves and figure out
who they are. Yeah.
And it's just really, really pushed to the extreme by the fact that it's about, you know, Dahmer went through the same thing as most everybody else did, but his was really extreme and really, you know, really bizarre, and he definitely had a harder time than I think the average person did. I really liked, and I mean, this was just something that was like too real to be true, and of course it was exactly true. On page 117, when they were talking about how the Jeffrey Dahmer fan club would sneak Dahmer into the different photos in the school yearbook.
Yeah.
And they snuck him into the National Honor Society.
I know exactly what you're talking about, yeah.
And
she marked his face out.
Yeah, the teacher saw him. They couldn't retake the photo, so she just took a marker and blacked out his face. And, like, that, you know...
The fact that he used a real picture really...
Yeah, well, that's exactly. Using that picture, which it was a famous picture.
Right.
Like, that's, like, Derf poetically just... you know, poetically says the photo would become the symbol of Dahmer's wasted youth. the boy who didn't belong. I mean, it's a picture of a bunch of kids. Jeffrey Dahmer is in the picture, but his face is blacked out, so he's not
Even
really,
worth noting,
there.
he's in the dead center. Like,
Yeah, exactly. Like
Yeah.
like I said, it's poetic irony, and it's like true classic tragedy.
right.
And it's just like the fact that it actually happened, it's too real. But that
It's
comes
shocking that it's real.
yeah, and that comes down to that whole thing of like, all fiction comes from real life, and
Right.
is real life imitating fiction, or is fiction imitating real life? Because that's how these stories get told, because they happen to somebody.
Right, and especially with the what you were just saying with the boy who doesn't belong.
Mm-hmm.
That for one, that sounds like a Harry Potter chapter. But
Yeah.
on a second serious note, when he realizes that his urges, his primal desires, are very, extreme and very surreal. If he doesn't have a family to talk to because his family is broken, he has to live with that. He is just him.
I think that's ultimately like the lesson of the book that I think Derf kind of gets across, is that, we all have problems, specifically teenagers. They all
Right.
have problems. They're all going through weird things.
It's our learning phase.
If they don't have like a network, or to use a specific term, if they don't have a family, which that's what your family is supposed to be,
Right. It's supposed to be your support net.
Yeah, your support net, exactly. People who don't have a family, I do think that causes them to develop in ways
Very negatively.
very negatively.
Yeah, I mean,
different than other people.
It's very, very varying extremes. In this
Mhm.
case, he went on to become a serial killer. He didn't have someone tell him, hey, this isn't okay. Hey, this isn't, or hey, this is okay, or hey, this isn't okay. And he just, I don't know. Sometimes it just felt like he really felt like that was his only option. That the way Derf wrote it, it seemed like there was a lot of times Dahmer felt like this was really the only way this can go.
Mm-hmm.
And it's tragic.
Yeah, I mean, it is tragic, and I think that kind of ties into, again, this whole book is kind of written with the hindsight of, this, because not just the hindsight of Jeffrey Dahmer has been caught, he's become a celebrity, and then he was killed in prison.
Right.
And so, and this is sort of that, like, I'm remembering these experiences with this kid, knowing that he had all these problems that, Derf wouldn't have necessarily known about at the time.
Right.
And so, it kind of ties in with a lot of if you read about Jeffrey Dahmer, a lot of people theorize, I should say, some of the psychiatrists that he talked to, I believe there was talk of part of the reason that he would cannibalize people and eat people was because of his deep-seated loneliness, and he just wanted people to be with him forever. And so,
and as messed up as that is to us, I can see the logic behind that.
The quote logic.
Yeah,
because
quote
he
unquote.
Just eat people. He was also near the end of his run. He was also preserving body parts and preserving people. So his apartment was just full of, preserved corpses.
Because I believe that's how he got caught, right? Because he had a body in his apartment.
Well, eventually, somebody escaped.
Oh, okay.
Somebody tried to kill, was able to get away and go to the cops, and then they went to the apartment and they just kept pulling out all these body parts. And it was like a horror freak show.
I can't even imagine.
Yeah. So
when, if you don't mind me asking, when was he caught? And was it early 2000s? Or did you say late 90s, early 2000s?
It was 90s. Dahmer was 91 or 92.
Okay, so that,
when he got caught. And then he was... he was caught in 91, and he was sentenced to life in prison. So, I'm sorry, 16 terms of life sentences. And then he was murdered in prison by another inmate.
I'm assuming not too far after he was in prison.
In 94. So he was in prison for 2 years.
Wow. That's longer than I thought.
Yep. But anyway, so like I was saying, a lot of people... Derf isn't the only person to talk about Dahmer's loneliness and his desire for people to stay with him. And so, kind of with all of that information about Dahmer, I think when Derf looks back on his experiences, he can easily see that, and you look back and he just sees like, yeah, Jeffrey Dahmer was obviously a very lonely kid in high school. Not necessarily to say that he was like abused. I mean, you could say he was psychologically abused.
Yeah, there was no signs of physical abuse.
Yeah,
I guess
what I mean
that's
to
a
say
big
is,
red card.
What I mean to say is, like, there are lots of kids that have a tough time in high school. Kids
Right.
get beat up all the time, whatever. But then Derf kind of talks about this. It's not necessarily that Jeffrey Dahmer was like an obvious victim all the time. It's just that he was obviously an outcast. He was obviously, somebody who didn't make a lot of connections. He didn't have any friends, or he didn't make. I think Derf does a good job of kind of explaining. He didn't make any like lifelong friends in high school, the way Derf did. Derf talks about that. Like this.
Derf even meets with his lifelong friends near the end of the book, and they even bring up like, whatever happened to Dahmer? It's like.
And they make the joke that he's probably a serial killer.
How
goodness.
How poetically perfect that is. I'm almost positive. I didn't read the full excerpt of the sources. I'm almost positive that was an actual line from them. Yeah,
that is exactly what they said.
I cannot believe that.
Mm-hmm.
That's almost borderline impossible to believe that they said that. But case in point, yeah, he didn't make any lifelong friends, like you were saying.
Mm-hmm.
And that it's I feel I do want to sympathize, but it's Jeffrey Dahmer.
Well, like Derf says in the book, let's see, because he talks about how he's not empathetic toward Jeffrey Dahmer, but he does have sympathy for the life that he led. But it's very important to stress that the sympathy ends once he starts killing. Like once Dahmer kills somebody, that's it. He's no longer somebody that's deserving of sympathy.
I feel like one of the last big scenes that I really kind of sympathized with him was where he showed the dog sympathy after he was ready to kill him. Mm-hmm. That was the first time that I went like, oh my god, this is Jeffrey Dahmer. What am I doing? This is Jeffrey Dahmer. Like, Derf did such a good job of, like, he let you know who it was, throughout the whole book with all his creepy stuff. But it's like, he just seemed like a weird kid for the most part until the, really bad stuff started happening.
Yeah.
And then the dog thing happened, and then I'm like, oh my god, like, I remember now. Wait. So the big first kill near the end of the book with the hitchhiker or whatever, that's where you really just, all of it's gone, like you were saying.
Yeah, and I mean that's what Derf says.
Yeah.
Like, that's at that moment, like that's like the turning point for Jeffrey Dahmer. That's where you stop having sympathy for him, and that's where he becomes the monster.
Yeah.
And that's, I mean, he's a murderer. He's past the point of no return. Like if you're reading the book, like I think a lot of people might come to this book and kind of expect it to be almost like a trash nonfiction, like a sort of tell-all,
right?
Like the secret,
almost like a textbook or something. Well, no.
I mean like a tabloid,
yeah.
Like My Secret Friendship with Jeffrey Dahmer.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Things like that, and that's really not what it is.
Not
I
even
think
a
that
little
the
bit.
book is a lot smarter. It's actually, I think the book is really smart.
Yeah, there's multiple times where I just caught myself like smirking, like, okay, yeah, that was clever, that was smart, or that was, very, very well written.
Yeah, that's actually, like, I think Derf. What makes this book so interesting coming from Derf, because Derf is a really funny guy, or like his cartoons are funny, I should say.
Right.
I haven't ever met the guy, but his cartoons are really funny, and this is not necessarily a funny book, but there are like little, like in the cartooning, there are little funny moments. He does a good job with like the character interactions, which again, since it's a memoir, he's just kind of just depicting. It all feels really natural. Like
right.
This is how kids are. This is how kids were. I did like how he included some of the other like weirdos, specifically the character of Fig.
Yes.
As like that was a kid who was like an obvious weirdo. Like that
Yeah.
was a kid who like nobody wanted anything to do.
He was
with.
the one who caused trouble, and
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he was the one that would act out.
Yeah.
And
It
like
seemed
he
like if
was
he
the one
didn't, he
that
wasn't going to get attention, And
yeah, exactly.
that was his way.
And the way the comic goes, Fig is the one who was acting out and who was getting the attention of all the adults. The adults were, constantly having to be on Fig.
Right.
And every time Fig, like, there's an incident with Fig, the adults are there, a teacher is there to deal with him. And that was the whole, like, kind of the theme of the book, is that nobody was there to deal with Dahmer.
Right.
Except
and it's like it's hard to say, like, it's easy, or it's rather easy to say, oh, they were just too busy with Fig to notice Dahmer, but it's like that wasn't the case, it just
right.
That was a happenstance of what was
mm-hmm. going
on.
Yeah.
And where were the adults, man?
I mean, it's a big question, and I think
high school is so pivotal in development. Like, everyone's like, oh, high school doesn't mean anything. You don't learn anything in high school. It's not, like, it is about what you learn, but it's also about, like, actual life experiences that you learn, like how to interact with people and how to interact with your superiors. And
yeah, I mean, I've heard it said, and I kind of agree, that going to high school is more about learning how to socially interact with people than it is about actually learning.
I feel like school in general, up until college, is a lot of that, just learning social interactions, and it's like that's why. Yeah, right. That's why, that's why I always get, like, I don't know, I get really apprehensive about homeschooling, and it's like, it gets real touchy, because it's like, that social interaction element is so important. Like, it's so unbelievably important. And, yeah, you're getting the knowledge and stuff, but you're not interacting with anyone.
I mean, I do agree. I do think that the catch to it all is, how responsible the parents are, because you can homeschool a kid and still have the kid be involved with lots of social interaction.
Right.
There are all kinds of programs out there, YMCA, all kinds of stuff.
Just the local sports team.
I mean, even church stuff,
right.
If that's what you do. So, like, there's all kinds of ways for kids to be socially active.
You just have to notice that it's important very early on.
Well, but it has to start with the parents.
Right, it does, yeah.
And on the one hand, I do kind of agree with Derf's, like, thematic question of where were the parents, why weren't the parents involved. But on the other hand, I do think that it's not specifically the public school's job to parent the child. That's the parent's child. And I do think that it's really unfortunate that somebody like Dahmer could just kind of drift through school and not have anybody intervene at all. That's, that is disappointing.
It's unfortunate.
Mm-hmm. But I almost think it's a little unfair to, like, lay the blame on, like, the school or the teachers.
Right. I mean, it definitely didn't help.
It's not necessarily what Derf is doing, but he does. He's
just bringing it to light.
Yeah, yeah. But yeah, it's a good book.
It's a phenomenal book.
Mm-hmm.
I walked away from this book just going, holy God, that was brilliant. Like, it was, like I said, it exceeded my expectations 1,000-fold. Yeah, but yeah, no, the book was stellar. I feel like I'm really glad that Derf was so descriptive with everything, because it really got me to, like, I feel like I got to know Dahmer at the best that anyone could from being on the outside like that, and that viewpoint was really interesting to me. It was really fascinating. And I loved all the messages that were reinforced throughout the book. The pacing was great. The art was great. This is a really good book. Especially, I'm not typically super interested in nonfiction. It's like I've got life to deal with nonfiction. Whatever. But this was very, very fascinating. This was a very exhilarating read.
Yeah, it is a. I think, as I kind of said earlier, it's just such reading this book is a unique experience.
It is.
It's a unique perspective on a unique individual in American history, no less. Like, it's such a melancholy story. Like, the whole book almost feels like it's just each page is just filled with regret.
Yeah.
I do kind of get the impression, and I don't know, I don't know how much Derf like can or should blame himself, but there is this longing, there is this sense of like almost like this disbelief that Dahmer ended up the way he did. This just sort of disappointment in everything, in every like in humanity, like this existential regret, I should say, not a personal regret on Derf's part, but like there's an existential regret that everybody failed Dahmer. There's also a simplicity to this book. I mean, it's an easy read.
It is.
Derf's cartooning style is very straightforward. Block panels. It's kind of that like right that in between like a comic strip and a comic book.
Right.
It's like I said, it's alt comics, like slice of life style comics.
Yeah.
But it's really easy to absorb everything that's all the information on the page, and it really works. I think it really works for telling the story of Dahmer, like with like Derf, like just that expression that he always draws Dahmer, like that really works for his style. That plain melancholy expression. It really, like Derf's style just really captures that. I think
it does perfectly.
Mm-hmm.
I noticed that even from the cover. Like, it just, if there would have been no name there, if there would have been no text there, my first instinct would have been like, oh man, that's like totally Jeffrey Dahmer.
Mm-hmm.
That it just nails it.
Yeah.
So yeah,
this
book was great. Thank you for recommending
really good
it.
Book. Yeah.
Thank you, Derf, for being a great writer.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So, so yeah, we definitely recommend if you want a somber story about high school loneliness and isolation that somebody can feel who goes on to become a serial killer. This is very specifically for you.
Yes, it's very, very specific.
Something that you might enjoy. Or if you just have, a lot of people I'm sure this book did pretty well as I understand it, and I'm sure plenty of it was just because people have a fascination with serial killers, and this definitely, I've said this before multiple times on this podcast, but it is just it's a unique look. You don't really kind of get anywhere else. There's lots of books that have been published. I mean, Jeffrey Dahmer's dad published a book, I believe. There were numerous news stories about Dahmer, but there's something about this book that I really like because it feels so detached from the celebrity of Jeffrey Dahmer.
It really does.
And it feels so personal because it is personal.
Yeah, like there was multiple times that like I just felt like we were really kind of getting to meet him, to a degree. Like he felt so believable.
Yeah.
And I love that.
Yeah. So I guess that's kind of ironic because in many ways, like I had said, a lot of people probably were wanting some kind of like tabloid secret life of Jeffrey Dahmer, and that's not what they got.
Where he secretly ends up being a vampire.
Yeah, exactly. But at the same time, what they did get was a very personal look at Dahmer's life in high school.
Yeah.
From a very personal perspective. And that to me is what really sells this book.
Oh yeah, that knocks it out of the park.
Yeah, that's what really captivates you as a reader.
Like I was saying earlier, high school is so pivotal in teenagers developing life, and it's interesting seeing how high school and the experiences outside of high school molded Dahmer, and seeing it from that outside source and not just from like Dahmer's parents or like his brother or whatever. Like it was interesting. It felt like you were saying much more personal, and that was refreshing.
Yeah, absolutely. So
yeah, that was My Friend Dahmer. And
that was My Friend Dahmer.
I'm so glad you got me to read it.
Yep. Yeah, that's a good one. I think we'll have to do some more Derf comics on the podcast. I really like Punk Rock and Trailer Park, so we'll probably do that one. It is kind of funny because like all of Derf's stuff is so different from My Friend Dahmer, but still, it's still Derf.
Yeah.
But there is something about My Friend Dahmer that is so so uniquely this.
Yeah.
And a lot of his other stuff is a lot more, like comedy, and
Right.
Cool stuff like that. So we will definitely have to do some more stuff by Derf in the future.
Derf, yeah.
So that was My Friend Dahmer. Luke and I both recommend that everybody read it. It's an interesting.
I feel like there's something for everyone.
Well, it's an interesting look at Jeffrey Dahmer. It's an interesting look at cartooning.
Interesting look at high school, slice of life, like you were saying.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, please read
it. That was good. Next week, or next episode.
Next episode.
In 2 weeks. The next episode, Luke and I are gonna break away from these, arty comics, and we're gonna go for the mainstream brass ring.
We're gonna do the New 52 Superman.
Oh, yeah, right.
Right.
Sorry,
end it now.
No, we are going to do some Batman comics. But we're not going to get too mainstream with this. We're going to do 2 Elseworlds stories. The first one we will do is Batman Gotham Noir, written by Ed Brubaker and illustrated by Sean Phillips. And then we will also be talking about another Batman Elseworlds story, Gotham by Gaslight, written by Brian Augustine and illustrated by Mike Mignola. So yeah, we are definitely
going a little out of our zone here.
Well, we did Wolverine, so I think
it was sort of Wolverine,
and these are sort of Batman.
Yeah, so that's perfect. Yeah, it's this sort of podcast.
Sort of a podcast. Yeah. So yeah, come back for those. I'm sure we'll have lots to say about Batman. As always, you can find new episodes of Comic DNA at comicdna.podbean.com, as well as newhavencomics.com. You can find us on Facebook, New Haven Comics on Facebook. I am Aaron Walther, also on Facebook. I'm also on Twitter.
I am Luke Moritz on Facebook.
Luke Moritz is on Facebook, too.
I'm there and here. That's pretty much it.
Yes. Yes, I am on Twitter. You can find me at AAWALTHER, AA Walther. And thanks again, everybody, for listening, and we will see you all next time.